The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Morra Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better. Adam Baruh is CEO and founder of the tech company SuiteCentric, a consulting agency that is a NetSuite solution provider. But like so many of us, he also has a side hustle. Hustle isn't quite the right word, though, because Adam's mission in that endeavor is really about improving how we work and making space for CEOs to be more vulnerable. Adam is reframing the stereotype of what he calls a CEO-type guy sounds like. And you'll love hearing about his journey from park ranger to wedding photographer to now founder and CEO. And also the imposter syndrome that accompanied him for a long time. On his podcast called The Change, he talks with servant leaders, people looking to normalize mental health conversations. He started this work in part because he finally learned to face a pretty serious past childhood trauma, something he'd ignored for much of his life. We'll talk about that, so a quick warning for those listening that this episode does briefly include mention of child sexual abuse. I was honored to speak with Adam as he shared his personal and professional story, and I started by asking him if he had always wanted to be a CEO.
No, and that's a good question. So my degree in college is in environmental studies, and I wanted to be a park ranger. In fact, I worked for the National Park Service when I was working on my master's degree. And so that was kind of the track that, I saw for myself. But what happened was I ended up, having, now my oldest daughter, who's almost 23. And, I had some computer skills from my job with the Park Service and kind of leveraged that to, now that I had a kid, I had to get a real job, right? So that's how I started in tech. And, for the 23 or so years I've been doing that. I've also done other things. I took a segue for about 10 years where I had a wedding photography business. And of the 10, I stepped away from consulting for 2.5 years where I just did wedding photography, and super fun. I got to, just be a part of many amazing weddings, working with many amazing couples, got to travel, all over the country, international, but, pretty hard to pay the bills, in that line of work.
I would imagine that being a wedding photographer requires you to have a lot of empathy.
You totally do.
Yeah.
Because especially the style of wedding photography that spoke to me, that kind of tapped into what I wanted to achieve was, I took a class, and now I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he was one of the photographers that I followed quite heavily back then. But he had kind of created the style called the Beloved Collective. And it was very much built around empathy, like using, games and exercises that I could use with my couples to get them to open up and be themselves, because my style was purely documentary. I looked at my role as a wedding photographer to just have my couples be themselves around me. And that requires, kind of going to emotional places with them. And so we would do these exercises, and I'd kind of break down those walls and then just naturally capture them being themselves. And, when I met my current wife, she was also a photographer. And so we did this work together. So the Beloved Collective, like these series of games that I'm talking about, there's different levels. Like level 1 is just kind of very light, kind of funny type of little games that we would play and, get the couples laughing. And then we would, depending on how open the couples were to this, we'd go into level 2, which is a little bit deeper. And then level 3, like, pretty emotional. I mean, we'd ask questions that would be pretty emotionally driven, and sometimes the couples would cry and I would be crying and my wife would be crying and we're all there crying, but it's like the true emotion and that true love that these couples had for each other was really what we were trying to capture on film.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. It's funny as you say that. I remember on my wedding day getting photos taken, and I can see those photos now. My face is so tight, not because I wasn't happy to be married. I think the stress of having to present for the camera and present this perfect life for everyone for one day. Oh God, I remember my face aching.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And because it's not just, you trying to present in front of a camera, but you're also worried about how's my family doing? How are my guests doing?
God.
Is everybody getting along? Is everything going well with my vendors and all that stuff? It's a stressful day, and as much as, we could inject fun into it, that's what we were about. So it was fun to do. I really liked doing it, like I said, but in the end, I had to step away from it and get back into NetSuite consulting because I'll share with you, it kind of financially ruined me. I mean, it's really hard to make it in the wedding photography business when, expenses are really high. It's really hard, especially here in the San Diego area. There's so much competition that in order to make it work financially, you'd have to charge something that people weren't willing to pay because they can just go to somebody else that was charging less.
So you had this business that you loved, but you realized financially it was draining you.
When my wife and I were actually planning our wedding in Italy, this is now, I think, about 9 months before our wedding, we actually went to Italy to just kind of check out this villa that we booked and, ask questions about, where do we have the ceremony and this and that and vendors to hire. And so we went out there. That was like the peak of my just financial worries and just being in not a great financial place. And I remember there was a night in particular, we were in Bologna. We ended up having to book this really expensive hotel because we just kind of went to Bologna without really much planning. We just hopped on the train and went up there, and we got there and everything was booked. There was some event happening in town and we couldn't get a room anywhere except for this super expensive hotel. So I did not sleep a wink that night because everything hit me. Everything, what am I doing? Is this what I want to do when financially it's making me so stressed out all the time? And it was that night, having not slept at all, that I decided, I can't do it anymore. I can't go forward with this, even though I love it so much. It can't be my future because it's not setting me up for my future.
How soon after that realization did you start your consulting firm?
Well, what happened was as soon as we got back to the States, I kind of put my resume out there to kind of re-engage in the NetSuite consulting space and ended up working for a NetSuite partner company, I think for about 2 years, and then got hired on to a customer I did a project for. You stayed with them for a couple of years, and then out of that formed SuiteCentric. And it's been, I really enjoy doing what I do, but it's an absolute roller coaster ride. And it's the emotional roller coaster journey, is pretty profound. I'm sure a lot of people kind of have the stereotype of a CEO that they're these strong, impenetrable people that, can just kind of withstand these ups and downs. But it's, in addition to parenting, it's the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life.
What do you think it is in your particular personality and character that makes being a CEO feel really challenging? What's the aspect of being a CEO that pierces your heart very deeply?
It's a good question. I have to think that everybody in a position like mine deals with these ups and downs, and it's just how we respond to the ups and downs personally that color that journey, that kind of paint that story. But for me, like I mentioned, I don't come from business school. I never really had any aspirations to be a CEO, but I've been doing this NetSuite consulting thing for about 16 years now. And so, I feel like my skill set is super strong. I'm very confident doing what I'm doing. And I kind of went down this journey of, after getting laid off for this company that I was working for, looking at what my next steps could be. And it felt like the right time to launch my own business. Now, in the early part of our journey here, we're just at that time, we were just professional services. So that in and of itself is going to be a roller coaster ride.
Oh,
because
yes.
when you have a lot of projects that you're working on, the revenues are great and you're riding high, but then those projects wrap up. And unless you have something else lined up next,
you're like, oh shit. I think of it like an accordion, opening and closing, the bellows on an accordion. Like you stretch with money and staff, and then all of a sudden it contracts.
Yeah. And you want to make investments. You want to grow, right? So you're making these investments when everything's riding high. And, it took me several years to realize that, I have to plan for the lows. I was speaking with a former colleague of mine who, I think he was quoting a book, and I'm not remembering the name of the book, but, in this book, they talk about the trough of sorrows, which is, in the roller coaster ride, it's those dips, right? And how to get through and basically work through those and learn from those dips, right? Because, I'll tell you, like, as painful as the dips have been, that's where there's been the most learning for me, both personally and professionally. And now 5.5 years later, we are a full NetSuite solution provider, which means we resell NetSuite software and licenses. And so there's this underlying, revenue that we get that helps kind of flatline those troughs of sorrows. So it's something that's going to help us go forward. But it took many years and many trials and tribulations to realize that, hey, this isn't working out. We need to kind of augment our business model so that we can kind of flatten out these curves.
That makes sense. So you speak often of being a servant leader. Can you first define what that is and then explain why and how you consider yourself a servant leader?
I really think a servant leader is just, a type of leader that recognizes that their role is to enable and empower the people that are around them, right? And I feel like that was kind of always my style, but, it took I guess 4.5 years of running my company to really recognize that was the role that I wanted to really wrap my arms around. And so, I think in what I experienced over the first 4.5 years running SuiteCentric was a lot of imposter syndrome. And for people that don't know what that term is, it really means just kind of fronting or trying to feel like you have to be somebody else that you're not. And so where that existed for me is because my background in my career really has been in the creative world and also as a software developer and not necessarily a CEO type person. I kind of felt like I was an imposter, right? I felt like I had to be and represent something that really wasn't internally aligning with me. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, I think my whole life I've always been like a highly sensitive person. I felt like a really strong sense of empathy within. But in my career, growing up for the last, 23 years as a Gen Xer in the business world, I felt a lot of pressure and there was a lot of competition doing what I do. And so I personally looked at my empathy and my sensitivity as a weakness, like literally something that I had to shove away and hide and not feel was a strength. But what started before the pandemic, maybe a year before the pandemic, was I started getting a lot of anxiety attacks. I had never really had them before, and I couldn't necessarily trace where they were coming from. But I think part of it was just living in this world, being a CEO, riding all these ups and downs, riding the imposter syndrome, trying to think I had to be somebody I wasn't, finally caught up to me. And then the pandemic really, kind of turbocharged all of that and ultimately led to, really severe anxiety attacks, claustrophobia. I couldn't really, there was one experience I had. I went to a customer's headquarters to have a meeting one day with just one person. And he set up the meeting in this, very large conference room they had. It was like an interior conference room, though. There was no windows. And I remember sitting in the meeting with him, just one-on-one, and all of a sudden, the panic attack set in, the claustrophobia. I had to excuse myself out of the room, kind of make excuses to.
What did you say?
I just said I wasn't feeling well. Yeah. And can you have the door open, turn on the air conditioning, that sort of thing. And I was able to, kind of calm myself down. But then what happened was with the pandemic, I really took a lot on. You know, your initial question was around being a servant leader. So when the pandemic hit, you know, I felt a really critical responsibility to my team more than ever. I just felt I had to do everything possible to ensure that I wouldn't have to lay anybody off. I didn't want people's, you know, my team members' livelihoods to be at stake based on me making my own mistakes. And so we had this project that came along, and I put myself in the position of being the lead developer, lead project manager, lead kind of everything, just to ensure that that project would be highly successful. And I was working about 70 to 80 hours a week.
Oh my God.
My youngest, who is now almost 3, so at the time he was about 6 months old, he's getting up 5 or so times a night. So I was already working late at night. So I said to my wife, like, you know, you stay asleep. I'll wake up when he wakes up and get him back down. And so in addition to the 70, 80 hour work weeks, I was sleeping about 3 hours a night, disjointed. And the panic attacks were just, I mean, several per day, every day.
Oh my God.
It's the worst thing I've personally ever, you know, gone through, because I couldn't see the end. I couldn't see how I was going to work myself out of it. Finally, what happened was I had the great luck and fortune to come across my executive coach, Kristen Taylor, who just, you know, I was marketed to on LinkedIn, and decided to just make an effort to do something about my own mental health. And so I hired her as my executive coach, and we started working together.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
I just want to ask, I mean, it sounds like your panic anxiety was pretty severe. Did you go to therapy? Did you see a psychiatrist? Did you take meds?
No, not at that time. But the first thing I did was I started working with Kristen. And it was maybe my second or third session with her. You know, I think she has a background as a therapist, but she was very careful to make sure that she was guiding me in the right direction. But what happened was, in that second or third meeting I had with her, I'm divorced. So I was married for, 15 or so years, got divorced. And my 2 older kids, you know, I shared with Kristen how I was, you know, even to this day, I feel a very strong level of guilt for, you know, some stuff that my older kids went through. And it was just a really painful and emotional place to, you know, that I hadn't resolved yet. And so Kristen asked me, she's like, well, do you feel shame or do you feel guilt, you know, towards that? I remember saying to her, I'm like, I don't really know the difference. Like, can you describe that to me? And she kind of talked about it in the context of like, well, shame is something that belief systems are built around, that identities can be affected by, versus guilt is, you know, something that you feel terrible about, but it's not really something that is you're going to build a belief system around, you know, about yourself. That was like a Friday that we had that conversation. And I went about the rest of my day, you know, went home later, did everything with my kids and the family, got the kids to sleep. And I remember I was watching a TV show, which kind of wrapped up at around midnight. The house is super quiet. Nobody's awake except for me. I turn off the TV, and that conversation re-entered my mind from earlier in the day. Shame, guilt. Is there anything I feel shameful about? And literally, like the parting of the sea, or just the way I describe it is like my higher self finally recognizing that I was ready to receive the information I received, which was I was molested at 6 years old. What happened was my mom had, you know, when she split with my dad, had hired this babysitter, this teenage kid. And as soon as my mom would leave, this kid would lock me in my mom's walk-in closet, barricade the door, have the light off in there, and then have his friends come over and they'd have a big party doing drugs. I remember seeing, you know, eventually when 2 hours or so later, when I'd finally get let out of this closet, you know, being terrified in there. And I remember just like that feeling of so much fear. And they'd finally let me out, and just seeing people totally wasted and passed out, needles, rubber hoses around people's arms. I mean, as a 6-year-old, can you imagine?
No, you must have just been absolutely scared to death.
Super scared to death. And then, I was molested. And, it was literally in that moment, that Friday night when the shame and the guilt, all of a sudden, I had never blacked out that memory. I just never spoke about it ever to anybody.
Okay, so can I ask you, so you knew as a child that you had been molested. This was wasn't a part of your story, but you hadn't repressed the memory so much that you didn't remember it.
Correct. I remembered it happened.
Yeah.
All of my life, I never thought it had any relevance or any subsequent impact. But, this realization that I had this Friday night after this conversation with Kristen, and this all happened within 5 minutes after turning off the TV and just thinking about this experience, oh my God, I have, from that, I think I blamed myself. I think that must have been my little 6-year-old way of coping, was just having agency over it.
Yeah.
Obviously it wasn't my fault.
Did you tell your mom?
Yeah, my parents knew, but, unfortunately, I just think that, being in the late 1970s, therapy and talking about these sorts of things wasn't really, normal or thought of as, something that it was okay, so no one ever really dealt with it. It just never got spoken about. I never spoke about it. I had never told my current wife. I had never told my ex-wife. No, I just never spoke about this again. But now when this realization hit me, I was like, this is literally the cause for my negative self-talk, my hatred that I have for myself that I had. It's still there a little bit today, but it's something I'm working on. And, some drug use and alcoholism and, probably just the way that it, I just wasn't dealing with things in my life, probably led to a lot of the reasons why I got divorced, and so the realization was just the impact that experience had on who I was at that moment, at that time a year ago, being, 48 years old, 49 years old, just now kind of everything hitting me at once, the impact of that experience.
There's so much, Adam, to unpack, and I feel honored that you're sharing your story. It is interesting. There's this through line of divorce and shame, in both what you experienced growing up, and then it sounds like in some of the feelings that you felt.
Yeah.
When you knew that what you felt was shame, was that clarifying for you?
Yeah. I mean, it explained everything to me.
Yeah.
And it really led me to understand that just under the surface, I think I had always thought that was my fault, that I invited it. But it really wasn't until this realization where I was like, what was I thinking? I'm a victim. There's no chance that as a 6-year-old that I invited that in. I didn't know about any of that stuff,
Of course.
That following week after I had that realization, I was so just looking forward to the next conversation with Kristen, who was the only person that I still opened up to about this stuff, to share this. I mean, I hadn't told her about being molested yet, but, I just was like, all right, now is my time to open up and start sharing and just looking at and exploring about how this has impacted my life. And so I told Kristen the following Friday, and it was just a very, I think emotional call for both of us. And then, we talked about how to kind of open up and share this with my wife, my kids. And so then, the next couple of weeks or so, I started opening up to them. And, it felt very freeing. This was the freest and most confident I had ever felt in my whole life, because now I understood, what had been going on that was driving all this kind of self-loathing and this negative self-talk over the course of my life. And now I had ownership over it. It didn't own me anymore. I'm in control. And, there was a lot of work that now I've been doing over the last, or year and a half since, this kind of all transpired. I'm definitely still a lot of a work in progress, but
who isn't?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But one thing that I'm fully recognizing now is that I am worthy of taking care of myself and prioritizing myself, like not in a selfish way where it's negatively impacting people around me, but in a positive way where, I recognize fully that in order for me to be the best leader and boss and father and husband, like I am worthy of enjoying my life, enjoying myself, doing the things that I want to do. And by doing so, it enables me to be a better boss, be a better leader, be a better father and husband.
A lot of the work on trauma from a psychological perspective has shown that trauma victims who have PTSD and who perhaps reflexively act out their trauma and react to it without doing what you did, which is integrating the fact that trauma happened to them, that they are a trauma victim, and that is part of their story. It's part of their self and their own personal narrative. That's really important, that the process of understanding your trauma and integrating it into your story is what's really, really important in the healing. And what's interesting to me is you are integrating it into your leadership and your role as a CEO, which is not something that we hear very often.
Well, I felt an obligation towards it. Again, I think just with my heart was directed to, remember I spoke about that imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Well, what all these kind of, realizations that I had made in my work with Kristen, what that led to for me in understanding about myself is that my sensitivity and my, kind of heightened empathy is actually my superpower. I mean, like I mentioned before, I thought it was like a fatal flaw in my character, right? Something that I had hidden for so many years. But it's when the imposter syndrome went away, is realizing, you know what? This is who I am. And I think there's a need, especially around the pandemic or early post-pandemic, there's a need for more empathy in the world, for more servant leaders that are trying to destigmatize mental health issues, right? And have that conversation around mental health issues be normal, because I think for so many years, especially in business, it was frowned upon, especially this concept of the CEO being this impenetrable, invulnerable person.
Well, the CEO could never be a victim. I mean, that's
right.
The framing that is so radical to me is, and I think really powerful, as someone who's talked to a lot of leaders, is you said I wasn't a CEO type guy.
Yeah. The way that I look at it now, though, here in the year 2022, is I think to be the most effective leader that I could be is going to mean that I have to model what it means to be a leader. And that means to be vulnerable and to open up and to share my story. It's why I'm speaking with you today. We talk at my company, like once I started to have all these realizations and recognize the type of leader and CEO that I wanted to be and kind of put that imposter syndrome aside, I started now investing in my team a lot more. So I had Kristen, as my executive coach, come in and give 4 1-hour sessions to my whole company on mindfulness and breathing exercises and work-life balance and harmony, whatever you want to call it. We invested in the Calm app. And so everybody at my company has the Calm app so they can, we talk a lot about meditation, which is also something that now I provide to my company weekly. There's a corporate meditation session, which I even kind of like had to remind my team last week, like, hey, when you do the meditation sessions, if you're going to join that, like we're paying for that. Like we'll like make sure you put in your time as, internal time, because we're not only going to provide the meditation for you, but we're going to pay you for the time to be a part of it. So, I think it's important that leaders, especially in this day and age, I think we just deal with so much now.
Yeah.
Especially around the pandemic and the racial divide and political divide and so many divisions that we experience today. It's important that we highlight and find those opportunities where we do come together and support each other.
I think meditation at work and the apps are great. But if the overall culture and the leadership doesn't support mentally healthy practice all around, they're just a nice to have. So I'm curious also how your evolution and also your realization that your empathy is part of who you are as a good leader. Like, how has that cascaded down to how you run meetings or how the company culture runs and is structured? Or has it?
Yeah, it definitely has. So, something that has been very, rife in the consulting industry, in tech especially, is working long hours. I mean, we're a professional services organization, so we bill by the hour, right? And so, in my own career, I'm just used to working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. I'm used to sacrificing vacation time, having to work on holidays, nights, weekends, all this stuff. And, I thought growing up in my career, I mean, that was all normal. That was all normal and expected in the consulting tech industry, right? And so I didn't want, my company to follow those same principles at the expense of my team members burning out. I've seen people burn out here where we have customers that, kind of drive my team members like, hey, we need this done. Like, are you working over the weekend? And so now I really, when I get those sorts of statements from my team members, like, hey, so-and-so customers is kind of, they're really on me at nights, weekends, they're texting me and slacking me. And so we put it out there to our customers like, hey, our team works a standard 40-hour work week. And that's really it. And so I really emphasize to my team members, we only expect you guys to work, whatever, 9 to 5 or whatever. If you want to work more, that's up to you. But we really advocate to not and to enjoy your life. I mean, some people like to just do the work. It feels good to them. So I'm not going to, get in the way of that. But, that's one of the things. Another thing is, I think, just how we deal with really stressful and negative things that happen in our day to day. I'm really an advocate for, let's kind of switch the conversation and let's find the positive in it to try to, coach my team to not be so reactive. And so, this is, I think, just various examples of where, we're trying to just make everybody's experience here, maintainable, supportable for them, where they know really that we have their backs.
Last question. If someone's listening and they think this servant leadership idea is really cool, how do you start?
You have to look within first as a leader, and you have to really gain a heightened sense of self-awareness. That's where it started for me. I really don't think I had the self-awareness that I have today. And so, by having the sense of self-awareness, it really gives me the ability to reflect on decisions that I'm making, how I'm acting, how I'm presenting. Like, am I doing things that are supportive of others and supportive of myself? Or is this decision I'm about to make, is it going to run counter to that? So, for business leaders that want to go down this path, look within, journal, identify what's important to you, both personally and professionally. Explore if there's negative self-talk there. Try to explore where that comes from and address it. Bring it out to the open. Be vulnerable and, share your story and model why to your team members. And then the other thing too is just really trying to tap into your team members. Like, do more check-ins, do more one-on-ones. Don't just talk about the work. Ask how they're doing. Say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing today? And when you ask it that way, it kind of incites a little bit more of a deeper response.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good framing. Yeah. Well, Adam, I really want to thank you so much to honor your leadership. And thanks for the interview.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today, Morra. It's just been a pleasure to talk about my journey and hopefully, it's going to inspire other business leaders to explore how they can become servant leaders, because we need it today.
Oh my God, we do.
Yeah, both, in all aspects of our lives, we need more empathy. We need to get into each other's shoes and really understand each other a little bit better. I think it's going to pave the way for a lot more unity. And so, yeah, again, thank you for having me today.
That's it for today. Our show is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to the great LinkedIn Presents family and to all of our guests for sharing their stories. If you love the show, tell your friends or leave us a review. You can always tweet me at Morra AM or find me on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, leave me a message, or subscribe to my newsletter for more from the Anxious Achiever world. Thanks for listening.